Hi again, everyone. This is your lecture on youth culture and deviance in SOCA1050, Youth, Crime and Gender. We've got Steve Threadgold joining us again this week. Thanks for being here, Steve.
No worries.
So in the first part of the lecture, we'll talk about youth culture and deviance. Second part, we'll talk about the privatisation and criminalisation of public space. And then we'll discuss a bit of a case study of this in graffiti in the third part of the lecture. So getting into it. Steve is a really well-known scholar of youth cultures and culture in general. So it's great to have you here to talk about this with us this week, Steve.
Yeah, no worries. It's my favorite topic. If I could do research on it whatever I want, whenever I want, I'd be doing a lot more stuff about subcultures and music and creativity and stuff. So yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite subjects.
Yeah, great. What's important about youth culture for this week, Steve, and in relation to, I guess, the issues we've been talking about in the course around youth identity, young people in contemporary society, and in relation to these issues of criminality, deviance,
Yeah.
culture.
Well, I think youth culture is a really interesting thing to study because it draws out so many aspects of those things. Much youth culture is positioned as being kind of deviant, even if it's not, even if it's pretty mainstream activity. Young people's activities are tended to be looked at through a suspicious lens of like, what are they up to? Why does it make me feel weird as an old person that these young people are doing this stuff that I don't understand? So it's a good place to look at all those kind of tensions in between in the world, I suppose, in terms of like power and resistance between notions of kind of mainstream and kind of subcultural creativity and artistic authenticity versus, co-optation and commodification. Very broadly, stuff like creativity and conformity and that kind of thing. So there's a long, couple of centuries of history of social thought about this kind of stuff that was probably popped up in the course already a little bit, and certainly in introduction courses to sociology and criminology, the Chicago School, original theorizers of subcultures, the Birmingham School that updated it in the kind of 60s and 70s and 80s in the UK. And that's kind of often played off a bit against kind of the Frankfurt School that kind of see everyone as cultural dupes and kind of mindlessly consuming. So um, all these kind of youth cultural practices are interesting to study because it draws out aspects of that in different ways. The
Yeah.
key way we were looking at, I suppose, in this course is this resistance is symbolic and through rituals. That very much that Birmingham School thing that kind of where young people, particularly young people that feel a bit kind of non-mainstream, that don't quite fit in, kind of construct their own spaces, try and find their own people to hang out with, to express themselves, kind of trying to find a way to live within marginalization or discrimination or just, feeling like they're not fit in rather than kind of overthrowing capitalism like the Frankfurt School asked for. So again, it's a nice place to look at young people's politics and creativity.
Yeah, so I guess it's linking to the earlier material we talked about in the course as well, like who decides what is deviant, who decides what, or how to even view what cultural practices are from young people. So, um, I guess there's politics infused with all of these different schools of thought, and
Mm,
the Birmingham school is one you can see the bolded part, it's sort of more on the side of trying to understand young people or people's actions as being sort of logical, understandable, strategic, trying to get by,
yeah,
um, rather than sort of positioning them as sort of wrong, immoral, or in needing of correction through all kinds of structural impositions to imposed on people's behaviour, punishments, all those kinds of things. So I guess seeing culture through that lens as being something that's strategic or important for the creation of identity, as well as just a feature of whatever the contemporary society's norms and constraints are, is an
mm.
important way for us to think about what young people do.
Yeah, that's right. And the Chicago School showed, young people in the US in, big global cities in so-called ghettos were attracted to forming gangs, for instance, through notions of status frustration. It seems quite logical if you look through their eyes about why people would kind of do those kind of things that most people see deviant or as illegal. Same with the kind of Birmingham School analysis of punk. You can see examples of, early 70s punks there. Um, a symbolic way of resisting the norms of society done by people that already felt like they were being kind of dominated and discriminated against. But what's also interesting is something like punk starts off, there's arguments whether it started off in America or the UK or whatever, but like more specifically, what often happens with something like a subculture is it changes over time. So it can start off as a relatively authentic expression of resistance, but these things are very often quickly co-opted. The aesthetics are kind of removed from the political practice and sold as fashion. And so there's again all these kind of interesting progressions that happen in that kind of relation between identity and ideology, creative and creativity and conformity.
Yeah. Yeah, and the reading this week talks a bit about creativity in relation to graffiti, but also YouTube. So I think creativity has an interesting place here that we don't normally think about in relation to crime or deviant activities. But I think it's an interesting way of yeah, cross-cutting these different issues, particularly if you're coming from a perspective of caring about young people, understanding what they do as being usually understandable or at least logical if you can understand their settings and contexts.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so this next piece is about sort of knitting these things together around youth culture and deviance.
Mm.
We touched on this in the first week of the course around, deviance is kind of in the eyes of the judger or the beholder. Whoever is doing the labeling usually gets to decide who's deviant, and whoever is doing the labeling, you'll already know is from a position of greater capital and power.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, really important kind of, I suppose, definitions here are that firstly, deviance is often associated with illegal, but it's not. It doesn't something doesn't have to be illegal for it to be deviant. So it's an important thing to think about how sanctions and these kind of ritualistic things work. Definitely like powerful people get to define what's normal and abnormal, like and what's deviant and not. And from the critical sociological land, it means that people with, more cultural, economic, social power get to basically prescribe their own lifestyles and interests as being normal and everything else is deviant or good versus bad, beautiful versus ugly or whatever. And there's lots of ways of thinking about that. Yeah, we spoke already about the kind of subcultural thing about how kind of things that can seem violent or deviant, maybe quite rational from the perpetrator's point of view, and if you think about the broader social things. Um, and yeah, like the notion of deviance, I would say that most people in some ways probably commit some kind of form of deviance every day. It's just like most of us just get away with it, right? Um, and it's interesting the way that things are kind of defined as deviant or not. I mean, the silly example I use in first year sociology quite a lot is like there's some studies done about people who pick their nose and eat it might have better immune systems than those that don't. So why would we have this terrible kind of social sanction against this thing that may be healthy, right? And there's like lots of sociology from the 1800s around manners and stuff like that, how manners are kind of developed not as a way to be clean or genteel or nice to each other, but as a way for kind of more wealthy people to exclude um, poorer people in kind of public settings in particular. And the work of Norbert Elias is really interesting to look at that. So
Mm.
um, deviance here definitely in the eye of the beholder. And when it comes to young people, old people just generally view young people through a deviant lens more often than not. It's just kind of the general subject position that older people seem to have towards youth. That they're going to be antisocial, that they're out of place, they should be at home and all this kind of stuff. Becomes particularly doubled down for anyone that's marginalized, so, young black youth or, are more targeted by those that are white. So sociology allows us to kind of understand the subject position of these people and maybe why they create their own cultures outside of the mainstream to be able to get by and feel like they have some kind of autonomy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the sort of the cruel irony, I suppose, is that those who are marginalized are much more likely to be on the receiving end of the worst kinds of state-sanctioned violence that
Mm,
will overblow any kind of activities that the young people themselves were engaging in, or they'll be sort of viewed through a deviant lens means you will be more likely to suffer from the
yeah,
impacts of that
yeah, yeah.
violence.
And like even a basic thing like time. can be seen through a normal and deviant lens, right? So like if it's 6 o'clock in the morning in a city and there's like a bunch of people coming out of a nightclub while there's a bunch of people going into a gym next door to each other, right? They're two very different things going on there, and one will see the other one as normal and deviant, depending on, which place you're going in and out of, right? So like this kind of stuff structures just day-to-day existence.
Mm. Yeah. Um, yeah, and so this is sort of putting putting the two together really around like the politics of creativity really and deviance, who can be seen as as what in what context. And I think these examples are such kind of classic sociology ones really, oops, because they show how the familiar can be made to look strange if by looking at the social and cultural context informing these figures. And the thing about, society and culture is it does change, right? If it didn't change, then things would be static. Things like norms would be easier to probably map over time, and we would have a greater sense of what endures and how what sort of societies we want them to be. But the world is changing so rapidly and has been for a very long time, will
Yeah.
continue to. And these kinds of different artists and music culture examples are really good markers, I suppose, of how these things shift.
Yeah, like Elvis is a great example. Wasn't allowed to shown on TV from the waist down in the 50s because it was seen as too sexual. But you get into the late 80s and 90s and you got Public Enemy, a rap group the midst of a huge moral panic then, around Public Enemy and NWA and these
Mm.
other bands that were seen as a threat to young people, singing about Elvis because and dissing him because he's racist, right? So pop culture draws out a lot of these kind of political things and allows us to kind of talk about them and have a discourse around them. But, what's seen as challenging in one decade very, very quickly and a few decades later can be seen as pretty lame or actually reactionary. Manet is another great example. Uh, like Pierre Bourdieu wrote a whole book about him, how he's kind of symbolically revolutionized artistic practices and what paintings were meant to look like. But now, Manet paintings kind of look like pretty lame, everyday items that are on people's walls or whatever, and kind of posters, not really thought as kind of being challenging art so much. Someone like David Bowie, the great artist, but like, there's debates about his kind of legitimacy, but he continued as that seen through a gendered lens when there's, a very prominent case where he had sex with an underage girl. It was actually kind of almost celebrated that kind of activity in the 70s and 80s. But when you look back now through a more progressive lens, we start to think about the legitimacy of those kind of things. So all these kind of examples um, draw out the kind of lines of what's politics, what's art, what's acceptable and what's not, what's creative and what's not, what's authentic and what's not.
Mm. Yeah. Okay, that's a great point to leave, I think, on for this part of the lecture. We'll be back with part two in a minute.